Sometimes a man reaches a point where all he wants is a place to call home. Caleb Stone had wandered the Montana frontier for so long, he'd forgotten what that felt like. With his last $200, he buys a rundown cabin in a forgotten valley. The roof leaks and the floors creak, but it's his. While fixing up the old place, he taps on a wall and hears a hollow sound. Behind a false panel, he finds a dusty leather satchel. Inside are old documents and something that changes everything. What he doesn't know is that this discovery connects to a deadly secret people have killed for. Word spreads fast in small towns, and soon dangerous men come looking. What was hidden behind that wall, and why does everyone suddenly want Caleb's cabin? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of pine and coming snow as Caleb Stone guided his horse down the narrow trail into the valley. 20 years he'd been wandering these mountains, moving from one camp to another, one season to the next. His beard had gone gray, his hands were scarred from 1,000 campfires, and his eyes held the distant look of a man who'd seen too many sunrises alone. The Springfield rifle across his saddle was older than some of the trees around him, but it had never failed him. Neither had his horse, a sturdy roan mare named Duchess, who'd carried him through 3 hard winters. The valley opened before him like cupped hands. Meadow grass, golden in the late autumn light, stretched toward a wall of dark pines. A creek ran silver through the middle, and there, set back against the tree line, stood a cabin. Even from a distance, Caleb could see it needed work. The roof sagged in the middle, one shutter hung crooked, and the chimney leaned slightly to the left. But it had 4 walls and a door, and that was more than he'd had in 2 decades. He'd heard about the place 3 weeks ago in a mining camp up north. An old widow in Pinewood was selling her late husband's hunting cabin, hardly used, way out in a forgotten valley. $200, cash money. It was every cent Caleb had saved from guiding hunters and trapping through the long Montana winters. Most men would have thought twice about spending their entire savings on a broken-down cabin in the middle of nowhere. But Caleb wasn't most men, and he'd reached a point where nowhere sounded just right. The town of Pinewood sat 5 miles to the east, tucked into a fold in the mountains, where the stage road cut through on its way to Helena. It wasn't much, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, and a handful of houses scattered around like dropped coins. But it had people, and supplies, and that thin thread of connection to the wider world that a man sometimes needed, even if he spent most of his time avoiding it. Caleb had ridden into Pinewood on a cold Tuesday morning, his horse's breath steaming in the air. He'd tied Duchess outside the general store and stepped inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The store smelled of coffee and leather and the sharp tang of kerosene. A pot-bellied stove glowed in the corner, and 2 men sat beside it playing checkers. The owner, a thick-set man with mutton-chop whiskers, looked up from behind the counter. "Help you?" "Looking for Mrs. Garrett," Caleb said. "Heard she has property for sale." The man's eyebrows went up. "You're talking about the old cabin out in Blackwood Valley. If that's what she's selling, been sitting empty 5 years now." The man studied Caleb with the frank appraisal common to storekeepers and bartenders. "You know it's way out there?" "No neighbors, no road to speak of." "Suits me fine." One of the checker players, a lean man with a star pinned to his vest, stood and walked over. "You're new around here." "I'm Tom Brennan, sheriff of this territory." He offered his hand, and Caleb shook it. The grip was firm but not challenging. "Caleb Stone." "Stone," Brennan nodded slowly. "I've heard that name. You guided that hunting party through the Bitterroots 2 winters back. Brought them all home safe when the early snow hit? That was me. Good work, that." Brennan studied him a moment longer. "You planning to settle or just winter over?" "Planning to stay if the place is what I need." The storekeeper, who'd introduced himself as Dutch Miller, gave directions to Mrs. Garrett's house. It sat at the end of town, a neat little place with lace curtains and a well-tended garden, even this late in the year. Mrs. Garrett herself answered the door, a small woman with white hair and sharp blue eyes that sized Caleb up in 3 seconds flat. "You're here about the cabin," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. If you're still selling." She invited him in, poured him coffee he didn't really want, and sat across from him at her kitchen table. The house was clean and spare, everything in its place. A photograph on the mantel showed a stern-looking man in his 60s, presumably the late Mr. Garrett. "My husband bought that land 40 years ago," she said. "Thought he'd hunt it, maybe build it up as a summer place. Never did either. Went up there maybe 10 times in all those years. It's good land, mind you. Creek never runs dry, plenty of timber, game moving through regular. But it's isolated. No one goes up that way anymore. That's fine with me." Her eyes searched his face. "You look like a man who's been walking a long time." "I have been, and now you want to stop." "Yes, ma'am." She nodded as if he'd passed some test. $200. "I have the deed right here. It's legal and clear. My husband bought it proper from the territorial office. 40 acres, including timber and water rights. Cabin's yours as is. I won't lie to you, Mr. Stone, it needs work. But the bones are good." They completed the transaction right there at her kitchen table. She signed the deed over in careful script, and Caleb counted out $200 in worn bills and coins. She gave him a key that looked older than the cabin itself and a hand-drawn map showing the trail in. "One more thing," she said as he was leaving. "That valley used to be called something else, long time ago. My husband always called it Blackwood Valley, after the family that settled it first. They're long gone now, but the name stuck. Blackwood," Caleb repeated. "Just thought you should know the history." Something flickered in her eyes. Memory, or maybe regret. "That land has stories, Mr. Stone, old ones." Now 3 days later, Caleb sat on Duchess at the edge of the meadow, looking at his new home. The cabin was smaller than he'd imagined, maybe 20 feet on a side, built from pine logs that had weathered to silver grey. A narrow porch ran across the front, and the door hung slightly ajar. Someone, probably Mr. Garrett on one of his rare visits, had stacked firewood under a lean-to on the north side. The pile was old and settled, but it would burn. Caleb dismounted and led Duchess to the creek for water. The horse drank deep while he surveyed the land. The meadow would be good for Duchess come spring. The pines would provide shelter and firewood. The creek meant fresh water year-round. It was everything he needed and nothing he didn't. He approached the cabin slowly, his hand resting on the rifle out of long habit. But there was no danger here, just silence and the whisper of wind through grass. He pushed the door open. It scraped against the floor, swollen from years of weather. Inside was one room with a stone fireplace, a small iron stove, a rough table, and a bed frame with no mattress. Shelves lined one wall. A ladder led to a sleeping loft under the eaves. Dust lay thick over everything, and mouse droppings scattered across the floor told him he'd have to evict some tenants. But the roof was intact, the walls were solid, and the fireplace drew well when he lit a test fire. That first night, Caleb unrolled his bedding on the floor, cooked beans and salt pork on the old stove, and ate sitting on the porch steps watching the stars come out. The silence was complete, except for the creak and the occasional call of a night bird. In 20 years, he'd never felt anything quite like what settled over him then. Not peace exactly, but something close to it. The sensation of arrival, of being finally where he was supposed to be. He slept that night without dreams, and woke to frost on the meadow, and his breath misting in the cold cabin air. There was work to do. Over the next 2 weeks, Caleb fell into a rhythm. He rose with first light, built up the fire, made coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Then he worked. He patched the roof with cedar shakes he split himself. He planed the door until it closed properly. He chinked gaps between logs with moss and clay from the creek bank. He cleared mouse nests and scrubbed every surface until the cabin smelled of lye soap instead of decay and time. The work felt good. His hands knew what to do. They'd built enough rough camps over the years. But this was different. This wasn't temporary shelter. This was permanent. Every nail he drove, every board he fitted, was building something that would last. Something that was his. He made one trip back to Pinewood for supplies. Dutch Miller greeted him like an old friend and helped him load flour, coffee, lamp oil, nails, and other necessities onto a pack mule he'd bought from a rancher down the valley. Sheriff Brennan stopped by the store while Caleb was settling his bill. How's the cabin treating you?" Brennan asked. "Good, it's coming along. You planning to winter up there alone?" "That's the idea," Brennan nodded. "Well, if you need anything, you know where to find us. Snow gets deep in that valley come January. You get stuck, you fire 3 shots, someone will hear." It was kindness, Caleb knew, the kind neighbors showed each other in hard country. He appreciated it, even if he had no intention of firing distress shots. He'd survived harder winters than Montana could throw at him. Back at the cabin, he continued his work. He built a proper bed frame and filled a mattress tick with dried grass. He constructed shelves for his few possessions, extra ammunition, traps, his small collection of tools. He hung his rifle on pegs above the door and his coat on a hook beside it. Little by little, the cabin became less a shelter and more a home. It was during the 3rd week while replacing rotted floorboards near the east wall that Caleb heard it. A hollow sound where there shouldn't be one. He tapped the wall with his knuckles. Solid log, hollow space, solid log. He ran his hand over the surface, feeling for gaps in the chinking. There, a vertical line barely visible, where 2 sections of wall met differently than they should. He fetched his knife and worked the blade into the gap. The section moved slightly. Not a wall at all, a panel. He pried gently, and a piece of wall perhaps 2 feet wide swung inward on leather hinges, so old they'd nearly rotted through. Behind it was a cavity carved into the thickness of the log wall, and inside that cavity sat a leather satchel covered in dust so thick it looked like grey fur. Caleb lifted it out carefully. The leather cracked under his fingers, brittle with age. He carried it to the table, brushed off the worst of the dust, and opened the buckles. They resisted, then gave way with small pops. Inside were papers. Documents folded and refolded, the paper yellowed and fragile. A small journal, its cover stained and warped. A hand-drawn map on heavier paper that had survived better than the rest. And underneath everything, wrapped in oilcloth, something that caught the lamplight and glittered, Caleb sat down slowly. His hands, steady as always, trembled slightly as he lifted the first document and began to read. The ink had faded, but the words were clear enough. Land grant deed. Territory of Montana, Blackwood Valley, recorded this 15th day of August, 1847. He read on into the evening, and with each page, the simple transaction of buying a cabin for $200 became something else entirely. Something that reached back through decades of forgotten history and forward into a future he couldn't yet see. Outside, the wind picked up, pushing against the cabin walls. The fire crackled, and Caleb Stone, who'd wanted nothing more than a place to rest, realized he'd stumbled into something that wouldn't let him rest at all. Not yet. The lamp burned low as Caleb spread the documents across his table. Each piece of paper felt fragile enough to crumble at a rough touch, so he handled them with the same care he'd use with a wounded animal. The leather satchel sat empty now, its contents laid out in the wavering light. The land grant deed was the first document he examined closely. It bore an official seal, half flaked away but still visible, the territorial seal of Montana before it became a state. The script was formal, the kind government clerks used when recording important transactions. It granted 400 acres in what was then called simply the Western Valley below the pass, to one Samuel Blackwood and one Joseph Garrett, equal partners for the sum of $50 and their service as territorial scouts, 400 acres. Not 40. Caleb read the description 3 times to be certain. The boundaries matched. The creek on the south, the pine ridge on the north, the meadow extending west to the rock face, and east to the old wagon trace. This wasn't just the cabin and a small plot. This was the entire valley. He set the deed aside and picked up the journal. The cover was unmarked, but inside, the first page bore a name in careful script. Samuel Blackwood, his private record, begun this year of our Lord, 1847. Caleb turned the pages slowly. The entries were irregular, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes daily. The writing style was plain but educated, the spelling better than most men of that era could manage. Samuel Blackwood had been literate, thoughtful, and from the early entries optimistic about his future. June 3rd, 1847. Joseph and I have staked our claim proper and received the grant today. 400 acres of Prime Valley land. The trading post we plan will serve the wagon trains heading west and the trappers coming down from the high country. Joseph has the business sense and I have the wilderness knowledge. Together we will build something lasting. August 12, 1847. The post is nearly complete. Joseph's wife Mary arrived from St. Louis with supplies and goods for trade. Our first customers were grateful to find civilization so far out. We took in $60 this week alone. October 20th, 1847. Joseph and I argued today about the division of profits. He claims his initial investment was larger. I claim my labor has been greater. We settled it fairly, I think, but there is tension now that wasn't there before. The entries continued through winter and into the next spring. The tension between the partners grew. Money was mentioned more often. Joseph accused Samuel of skimming from the till. Samuel accused Joseph of hiding inventory. Their wives stopped speaking. The trading post prospered even as the partnership deteriorated. Then came the entry dated July 15th, 1848. Joseph has accused me publicly of theft. He claims that $300 in gold coin has gone missing from our safe. I swear on my children's lives I took nothing. But his family has influence in the territorial office, and mine does not. The sheriff sides with Joseph. I'm to be arrested tomorrow. Mary begs me to flee. I cannot abandon my family, yet if I stay, I will hang for a crime I did not commit. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later and written in a shakier hand. We fled in darkness, Mary, the children, and myself. We took only what we could carry and what was rightfully ours, our share of the business, which Joseph now claims entirely for himself. We are hiding in the high country while I determine our course. Joseph has men searching for us. They call us thieves and fugitives. The truth has no voice when money and influence speak. Caleb read on, his coffee going cold beside him. The story that emerged was one he'd seen variations of before. 2 men, once friends, destroyed by greed and suspicion. But there were details here that didn't fit the simple pattern. Samuel's entries became increasingly desperate but also increasingly detailed. He wrote about hiding caches, about insurance against Joseph's lies, about evidence that would prove his innocence. August 30th, 1848. I have divided our legitimate savings into 3 locations, marked on the map I carry always. If something happens to me, Mary will know where to look. But more important than money is the truth. I have collected proof of Joseph's real crime. It was he who stole from the safe, planning to blame me all along. His scheme runs deeper than simple theft. He is part of a ring that falsifies land claims, that drives out legitimate settlers to seize their property. The territorial judge is complicit. The surveyor is paid to alter records. I have documents that prove all of it. September 10th, 1848. Joseph's men are close. I can feel them in the forest. Mary and the children are away, safe with her brother in Oregon Territory. I've returned alone to the valley one last time to hide the evidence where it can be found by someone honest, should I not survive to present it myself. The cabin we built is now Joseph's by his false claim, but he does not know all its secrets. I built a place within the walls where truth can wait. The entries stopped there. The last pages of the journal were blank. Caleb sat back, his mind working through the implications. Samuel Blackwood had hidden evidence in this cabin 70 years ago. Evidence of corruption, of a conspiracy to steal land claims. And then he'd vanished, arrested, killed, or fled so far no one ever heard from him again. Joseph Garrett had won. He'd claimed the trading post, the land, everything. He'd built a life and a family on what might have been stolen ground. And when the territorial government had resurveyed years later, someone, perhaps Joseph himself, perhaps the corrupt surveyor, had changed the records. 400 acres became 40. The full extent of the original claim was buried in forgotten archives. Until now, Caleb picked up the map. It was hand-drawn but skillfully done, showing the valley in detail. 3 locations were marked with small X's. One was near where the trading post had stood, according to the journal. One was at a mine shaft in the hills to the north. And one was, Caleb traced the line carefully, beneath the hearthstone of this very cabin. He stood and walked to the fireplace. The stones were set solidly, mortared with clay, but the hearthstone itself, the large flat rock that formed the base, showed gaps around its edges where the mortar had crumbled away over decades. He fetched his pry bar and worked it into the largest gap. The stone resisted, then shifted. He pried harder, and it lifted with a grinding sound. Underneath was a hollow space, lined with flat rocks. And inside that space was an oilskin package, wrapped tight and sealed with wax. Caleb lifted it out. The oilskin had protected its contents well. He cut the wax seal carefully and unfolded the wrapping. Inside was another set of documents, official-looking papers with seals and signatures, and a small ledger filled with columns of numbers and names. These were the evidence Samuel Blackwood had written about. Caleb spent the next hour reading them by lamplight, and with each page, his understanding of the situation deepened and darkened. The documents were explosive. They showed systematic fraud in the Territorial Land Office dating back to the 1840s. Legitimate claims were being altered or cancelled. The land was then sold to members of the conspiracy at pennies on the dollar. Settlers who protested were driven off or worse. The ledger listed names. Joseph Garrett was there, but so were a territorial judge, 2 surveyors, a claims clerk, and several businessmen from Helena and Virginia City. They'd stolen thousands of acres over the years. They'd built fortunes on it, and Samuel Blackwood had documented it all, probably in the desperate hope that the truth would someday matter. Caleb refolded the documents and sat thinking. The smart move would be to burn everything and pretend he'd never found it. These were old crimes, old sins. Everyone involved was long dead. What good could come from digging up bones that had been buried for 70 years? But then he thought about Samuel Blackwood, hiding evidence in a wall, hoping someone would care enough to use it. He thought about the land deed that showed 400 acres, while the territorial records claimed only 40. He thought about Mrs. Garrett and the look in her eyes when she'd mentioned the valley's history. And he thought about the fact that he'd bought this cabin legally, with honest money, from the descendant of the same Joseph Garrett who'd started this whole ugly business. Did she know? Had the family passed down the story, or had it been buried with Samuel and his truth? The wind rattled the windows. Caleb added wood to the fire and poured fresh coffee. He laid out the map again and studied the other 2 marked locations. If Samuel had hidden evidence here, what had he hidden at the other sites? More documents. The money he'd mentioned dividing. The sensible thing would be to leave it alone. But Caleb had never been entirely sensible, and something about this situation felt unfinished in a way that bothered him. Samuel Blackwood had been wronged. He'd tried to make it right, and he'd failed. Maybe it was foolish to care about justice for a man 70 years dead. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. But Caleb had spent 20 years wondering because he'd once failed to stand up when standing up mattered. He'd walked away from a fight he should have taken, and a good man had died because of it. That was his private shame, the thing that had sent him into the mountains and kept him moving for 2 decades. He couldn't undo that old failure. But maybe he could finish what Samuel Blackwood had started. The decision made, Caleb carefully repacked the documents in their oilskin wrapping and returned them to the hollow beneath the hearthstone. He kept out only the map and the journal, which he placed in his own pack. Tomorrow he'd begin checking the other locations. Tonight he needed rest, but sleep came hard. Every sound outside, the wind, a branch creaking, an owl's call, made him wonder if someone else knew about the cabin's secrets. Mrs. Garrett's words came back to him. That land has stories. Mr. Stone, old ones. Had she been warning him or simply stating fact? Did the Garrett family know what Samuel had hidden? And if they did, would they want it to stay hidden? He finally dozed near dawn and woke with full light streaming through the windows. The fire had burned down to coals. He rebuilt it, made breakfast, and was cleaning his plate when he heard horses outside. Caleb moved to the window and looked out carefully. 2 riders sat their horses at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. They weren't moving, just watching. One was a big man in a dark coat. The other was smaller, wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. They stayed there for perhaps 5 minutes, not approaching, not calling out, just watching. Then they turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come, disappearing into the tree line. Caleb checked his rifle, then stepped outside. The morning air was cold and clean. He walked to where the riders had been and studied the ground. Fresh tracks, clear in the soft earth near the creek. 2 horses, both shod, both carrying weight. The riders had come from the direction of Pinewood. He followed the tracks back into the trees for 100 yards until they joined the main trail. Then he returned to the cabin, his mind working. Those men hadn't been passing through. They'd come specifically to look at this place. To look at him or look for something? Inside, Caleb stood before the table covered with 70-year-old documents and realized that whatever Samuel Blackwood had started, it wasn't finished. Not by a long measure. And somehow, impossibly, people in the present day seemed to know about it. The satchel that had waited decades in a hidden wall had contained more than old papers and forgotten history. It had contained a living secret, one that someone, somewhere, still cared enough about to send riders into the mountains to watch a stranger's cabin. Caleb poured another cup of coffee and sat down to study the map more carefully. He had a feeling his quiet retirement was about to become considerably less quiet. The lamplight flickered as Caleb turned another page of Samuel Blackwood's journal. He'd read it through once already, but now he was going slower, looking for details he might have missed. Outside, night had settled over the valley again, and the wind carried the promise of the season's first real snow. The journal entries revealed more than just the outline of a partnership gone wrong. They showed a man's life in careful detail, his hopes, his doubts, his growing fear. Samuel Blackwood had been 32 when he started the journal, a former Army scout with a wife and 2 young children. He'd met Joseph Garrett in Virginia City, where Garrett was working as a claims agent. They'd become friends, or what passed for friendship between men who saw opportunity in each other. May 15th, 1847, one early entry read, "Joseph has a gift for numbers and negotiation. He can talk a man into seeing value where none seemed to exist before. I worry sometimes that this gift extends to talking himself into believing his own exaggerations, but perhaps I am too cautious. He assures me the trading post will prosper beyond our dreams." The entries through that first summer were optimistic. The 2 men worked well together. Joseph handled the business end, inventory, pricing, dealing with suppliers and customers. Samuel managed the physical side, building, hunting to supplement their supplies, scouting for the wagon trains that would become their customers. Their wives got along, their children played together. It should have been the foundation of something lasting, but money changed things. It always did in Caleb's experience. By autumn of that first year, the trading post was bringing in steady profit. They'd done well, and that success had somehow poisoned what should have been satisfaction. November 3rd, 1847. Joseph insists on a new arrangement. He claims his initial capital investment was 60% of the total. Thus, he should receive 60% of profits. I pointed out that my labor has built this enterprise as much as his money, and the original agreement was for equal partnership. We argued for 2 hours. Mary says I should agree to keep the peace. I do not know what I should do. The next months showed the relationship fracturing. Joseph accused Samuel of taking goods for personal use without recording them. Samuel accused Joseph of understating profits to reduce Samuel's share. Neither accusation seemed to have real evidence behind it, just suspicion feeding on itself until it became something ugly and corrosive. Then came the theft. $300 in gold coin, missing from the safe to which both partners had keys. Joseph discovered it missing and immediately accused Samuel. Samuel's denial meant nothing against Joseph's certainty and connections. The territorial sheriff, a man named Dawson, who owed Joseph money, sided with the Garretts without much investigation. Caleb could see how it had unfolded. He'd seen similar situations before, one man with influence, one without. Justice became less about truth and more about who had the louder voice. Samuel hadn't stood a chance, but what made the journal truly interesting were the entries from Samuel's time in hiding. He'd taken his family into the high country and begun to investigate. And what he'd discovered was that the theft was never about $300. It was about the land itself. August 15th, 1848. I've been watching the Territorial Claims Office. Joseph meets there weekly with Judge Harlan and a man named Severs, who works as surveyor. I followed Severs and saw him alter a boundary map. I later checked the official records. The Palmer family claim has been reduced from 200 acres to 50. Severs filed the amended survey. Judge Harlan approved it. And 3 days later, Joseph purchased the unclaimed land for $5. Samuel had documented a dozen such cases. Legitimate settlers would file claims, work their land, build their homes. Then months or years later, they'd discover their claims had been altered. Boundaries changed, acreage reduced, sometimes entire claims cancelled on technical grounds. The freed land would then be sold at auction, always won by Joseph Garrett or his associates at absurdly low prices. It was systematic fraud, and it had been going on for years. The territorial government in those days was barely functional. Record-keeping was haphazard, and communication between offices was slow. A few corrupt officials could manipulate the system for enormous profit. And they had. Samuel's entries became increasingly desperate as he realized the scope of the conspiracy. His initial theft charge had been just a convenient excuse to seize his share of the trading post and the valley land. But Joseph and his partners weren't content with one score. They were building an empire on stolen ground. September 8th, 1848. I have copies of the original claims and the altered surveys. I have the ledger I took from Joseph's desk, showing payments to Judge Harlan. I have sworn statements from 3 settlers who were driven from their land. This is enough to bring charges, but I must get it to territorial authorities in Helena. The problem is that Judge Harlan has issued a warrant. I'm wanted for theft and for assault, another false charge. If I am arrested before reaching Helena, these documents will disappear, and the truth with them. The final entries showed Samuel making his preparations. He'd sent his wife and children to Oregon Territory, where her brother had a farm. He'd divided their legitimate savings, money he could prove was his from before the partnership, into 3 caches, and he'd hidden the evidence in places he thought someone might eventually find. September 12th, 1848. If you are reading this, I am likely dead or fled beyond reach. My name is Samuel Blackwood. I was not a thief. I was not a criminal. I was a man who saw corruption and tried to stand against it. To my son, should you ever read these words, the truth matters more than gold. Our family name matters more than land. If you can use what I have hidden to restore our honor and stop these men from stealing from others, then my sacrifice will have meaning. The map shows 3 locations. The cabin holds documents. The trading post site holds our savings. The mine shaft holds the final proof. Use them well. That was the last entry. After that, only blank pages. Caleb closed the journal and sat in the silence of the cabin. Samuel Blackwood had probably been arrested or killed shortly after writing those words. His family in Oregon Territory would have waited for word that never came. Eventually, they would have assumed him dead, and Joseph Garrett would have gone on with his life, his reputation intact, his fortune growing. He'd raised a family on stolen land and ill-gotten wealth. His descendants, like Mrs. Garrett, probably knew nothing of the crimes that had founded their legacy. Or if they knew something, they might know only the Garrett family version of events, where Samuel was the villain and Joseph the victim. Caleb stood and walked to the window. Dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting the snow on the high peaks pink and gold. The valley was beautiful in the early light, peaceful and untouched. It was hard to imagine that 70 years ago men had fought over this ground, that lies and greed had destroyed a partnership and probably ended a life. But history was like that. Beautiful places held ugly secrets. The land remembered nothing, but the stones and walls built by human hands sometimes kept their secrets for generations. He needed more information. The journal told Samuel's side of the story, but Caleb wanted to understand the whole picture. That meant going back to Pinewood and asking questions. Carefully, he saddled Duchess and rode out mid-morning. The trail was clear, the weather holding. He made good time and reached Pinewood by early afternoon. The town looked the same as before. Quiet, a few people moving about their business, smoke rising from chimneys against the cold. Caleb tied Duchess outside the general store and went in. Dutch Miller was behind the counter, sorting through a shipment of canned goods. He looked up and smiled. "Mr. Stone, good to see you. How's the cabin? Coming along. I came for supplies, but also to ask a question if you don't mind." "Ask away." "The valley where my cabin sits. Mrs. Garrett said it used to be called Blackwood Valley." "Do you know anything about that?" "About the family?" Dutch's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "That's old history." "Before my time even. But I've heard stories." "What kind of stories?" Dutch glanced around the empty store, then leaned on the counter. "The way I heard it, there were two families back in the territorial days, Blackwoods and Garretts. They were partners in a trading post. Something went wrong, money disappeared, and the Blackwoods left in the night. Ran off, people said. The Garretts claimed they were thieves. What do you think happened?" "I think it was probably more complicated than either side admitted. These things usually are, but the Garretts stayed and prospered, and the Blackwoods disappeared. History's written by those who stick around. You know anything about the land claims from back then?" Dutch straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why are you asking about this, Mr. Stone?" "Just curious. Found some old papers in the cabin. Got me wondering about the history." "What kind of papers?" Caleb shrugged. "Old deeds, some personal writings. Nothing important, probably." Dutch was quiet for a moment, studying him. "Let me give you some advice. The past is past. Those old feuds, those old claims, they're dead and buried. Mrs. Garrett is a good woman. She sold you that cabin fair and square. Whatever happened 70 years ago doesn't matter now. You're probably right. I am right. Now what supplies do you need?" Caleb bought flour, coffee, beans, and ammunition. As Dutch was tallying the bill, the door opened and Sheriff Brennan walked in. He nodded to Caleb. "Mr. Stone, didn't expect to see you in town again so soon. Needed supplies. How's the cabin treating you?" "Good. Quiet." "That's good." Brennan paused. "Had any visitors up there?" The question was casual, but Caleb heard the weight behind it. "Why do you ask?" "No reason. Just that there's been some strangers in town the last few days. 3 men, rough types. They've been asking questions about properties out in the valley areas, specifically about old claims and who owns what now. They ask about my place. Not by name, but they asked about the Blackwood Valley area. I told them that land's privately owned. They didn't seem pleased to hear it." Caleb thought about the 2 riders who'd watched his cabin. "These men have names?" "They're staying at the boarding house. Registered as Smith, Jones, and Brown." Brennan smiled without humor. "I doubt those are their real names. The leader is a big fellow, maybe 40, dark coat and a scar on his left cheek. The other 2 are younger, harder to read. They're not here for the scenery. Any law against asking questions?" "No, but my instinct says they're trouble. If they come out your way, be careful." "I'm always careful, Sheriff." After he left the store, Caleb stood on the boardwalk looking down the street. The boarding house was visible from here, a 2-story building with a faded sign. As he watched, 3 men emerged. The description fit. The big one in the dark coat led the way, the other 2 following like wolves, trailing a pack leader. They walked to the saloon and went inside. Caleb considered following, then decided against it. No point in pushing too obviously. Instead, he loaded his supplies onto Duchess and prepared to leave. A young man approached from the direction of the livery stable. He was maybe 18, thin and nervous-looking. "Mr. Stone." "That's me. I'm Billy. I work at the stable. Mr. Miller asked me to bring a message to you, but then I saw you were still here." "What message?" Billy glanced around, then spoke quietly. Those three strangers. This morning they asked me about trails to the valley. They wanted to know which cabin was the one Mrs. Garrett sold. I didn't tell them nothing, but they paid me $5 just for describing the trail. Thought you should know they're planning to come out your way. I appreciate the warning. Mr. Miller says you seem like a decent sort. Says if those men are interested in your place, there's probably a reason, and it's probably not a good one. Caleb handed Billy $1. Thank you for the message. You see or hear anything else that might concern me, I'd appreciate knowing about it. Billy pocketed the coin and nodded. Yes, sir. Be careful out there. Caleb rode back to the cabin, with his mind working through possibilities. The timing was too neat to be coincidence. He'd found the hidden documents, and within days, strangers appeared asking questions about his property. Someone knew about the satchel. Someone knew what Samuel Blackwood had hidden. But how? The Garrett family. That seemed most likely. Maybe there had been stories passed down through generations. Stories about Samuel Blackwood hiding something before he disappeared. Stories that became family legend or family worry. And now, with a stranger buying the old cabin and settling in, maybe someone decided it was time to retrieve whatever Samuel had hidden before this stranger found it. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe the conspiracy Samuel had documented hadn't really ended 70 years ago. Maybe it had just evolved, changed form, continued under different names. That ledger he'd found listed names and crimes, but what if the system they'd built had outlasted them? What if there were still people profiting from those old frauds, protecting those old secrets? He reached the cabin as the sun was setting. Before going inside, he walked the perimeter, checking for signs that anyone had been here while he was gone. Nothing obvious, but he set some telltales anyway. A thread across the door, a twig placed just so on the windowsill. Small things that would show if someone came snooping. Inside, he lit the lamp and checked that the documents were still safely hidden beneath the hearthstone. They were. He made dinner, cleaned his rifle, and tried to think through his next move. The smart play was still to burn everything and forget about it. But that option was closing. If people knew he'd found something, burning the documents wouldn't make them go away. They'd just assume he was hiding what he'd found, and they'd come after him harder. No, the only way through this now was forward. He needed to check the other 2 locations Samuel had marked on the map. If there was more evidence, he needed to secure it. And then he needed to decide what to do with all of it, whether to let old sins stay buried or bring them into the light. He pulled out the map and studied it by lamplight. The trading post site was maybe 3 miles north, near where the creek branched. The mine shaft was further, up in the hills. He could reach both in a day's ride if he started early. Tomorrow, then, he'd find out what else Samuel Blackwood had hidden. And maybe that would tell him why, 70 years later, dangerous men were suddenly interested in a broken-down cabin in a forgotten valley. Outside, the wind rose and the first snowflakes began to fall. Winter was coming to the high country, and with it, Caleb suspected, a reckoning that had been delayed for far too long. Dawn came cold and clear. Caleb was up before first light, building the fire and making coffee. The snow from the night before had dusted the valley white just an inch or 2, but enough to show tracks. He checked the telltales he'd set, all undisturbed. No one had come during the night. He ate a quick breakfast of fried cornmeal and salt pork, then saddled Duchess. The mare stamped and snorted in the cold air, her breath steaming. Caleb secured his rifle in the saddle scabbard, tucked Samuel's map inside his coat, and rode out as the sun broke over the eastern ridge. The trading post site wasn't hard to find. Samuel's map was detailed, and the landmarks hadn't changed much in 70 years. Caleb followed the creek north until it split around a low rise covered in pine. There, in a clearing that would have been ideal for a trading post, he found the remains. The foundation stones were still visible beneath the snow and overgrowth. The outline of a substantial building, maybe 30 feet by 40, with what looked like smaller outbuildings nearby. A stone-lined well sat in the center of the clearing, its wooden cover long rotted away. Rusty iron fittings lay scattered in the brush, hinges, nails, a broken pot. Caleb dismounted and walked the site slowly. 70 years of weather and forest reclamation had nearly erased the place, but the bones were still there. This had been a real enterprise, solid and well built, not the work of fly-by-night opportunists, but of men planning to stay and prosper, according to Samuel's map. His cache was hidden 20 paces north of the well, beneath a distinctive boulder shaped like a broken tooth. Caleb counted off the paces through the snow. The boulder was still there, half buried in pine needles and moss. He walked around it, looking for any sign of disturbance. The north side showed a gap where the boulder sat slightly raised on smaller stones. Caleb wedged his fingers into the gap and pulled. Nothing moved. He fetched his pry bar from the saddle pack and worked it into the space. Using a fallen log as a fulcrum, he levered the boulder up and to the side. It moved with a grinding sound, rolling just far enough to reveal a hollow underneath. Inside was a rotted wooden box, collapsed in on itself. Caleb cleared away the debris carefully. The box had contained something wrapped in oilcloth, and that wrapping had held better than the box. He lifted out the package and carried it to a flat rock where he could examine it properly. Inside the oilcloth was exactly what Samuel had promised: money. But not the $300 that had supposedly been stolen. This was more, much more. Gold coins, maybe $2,000 worth, wrapped in bundles with paper notes indicating their source. June 1847 profits, September 1847 surplus, December 1847 retained earnings. This was Samuel's legitimate share of the trading post, carefully saved and hidden against need. He'd written in his journal about dividing his savings, and here was proof he'd done it. This money predated the theft accusation. It was honestly earned, but there was something else in the oilcloth package. A pocket watch, tarnished silver with a dented case. Caleb turned it over. Engraved on the back were the initials SB and the date 1845. He pressed the catch and the case opened. Inside the cover was a faded photograph, a daguerreotype of a young woman holding a baby with a small boy standing beside her. Samuel's family. The watch had stopped at 3:47. The hands were frozen there, marking some long-ago moment. Caleb wound it gently, not expecting it to work. But the mechanism caught and the second hand began to tick. The watch still functioned after all these years. He held it for a long moment, this intimate object from a man's life. Samuel had hidden his money here, but he'd also hidden something precious, a link to his family, proof of who he was beyond the accusations and the flight. The man who'd carried this watch hadn't been a thief. He'd been a husband and father, someone who'd valued the picture of his loved ones enough to keep it safe even as his world collapsed. Caleb wrapped everything back in the oilcloth and secured it in his saddle pack. The coins were probably still legal tender, worth their weight in gold. But the watch was worth something different. It was proof of Samuel's humanity, his reality. He'd existed. He'd loved. He'd been more than just a name in an old journal. Movement in the trees caught Caleb's eye. He turned slowly, his hand dropping to his rifle. A deer, just a doe picking her way through the snow. She looked at him with dark eyes, then bounded away. He let his breath out slowly. The search for answers was making him jumpy. But jumpiness wasn't all bad. Not with strangers asking questions in town. He mounted Duchess and continued north, following Samuel's map toward the mine shaft. The terrain grew rougher as he climbed, the trees thicker. This was old-growth forest, the kind that took centuries to develop. In 1848, it would have looked much the same. The mine shaft was harder to find than the trading post site. The map showed it up a narrow draw near a distinctive rock formation, but landslides and tree growth had altered the landscape. Caleb spent an hour searching before he spotted the entrance, almost completely hidden behind a curtain of roots and fallen timber. He tied Duchess to a tree and approached on foot. The mine opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He lit his lantern and peered inside. The shaft went back into darkness, shored up with timbers that looked surprisingly solid for their age. This wasn't an abandoned mine. According to Samuel's journal, this was a cache site he'd chosen specifically because it was isolated and unlikely to be disturbed. Caleb pulled aside enough debris to widen the entrance. then squeezed through with his lantern held before him. The shaft went back about 20 feet, then ended in a small chamber where the miners had stopped digging. The rock here was wrong for gold or silver, which explained why they'd quit, but it made a perfect hiding place. The floor was dusty and undisturbed, except for ancient boot prints near the entrance. Samuel's map marked the cache as being in the back left corner beneath loose rocks. Caleb found the spot and began removing stones. They came away easily, and beneath them was another oilcloth package, this one sealed with wax. He carried it outside into the daylight before opening it. The wax seal broke with a crack, and he unfolded the oilcloth carefully. Inside were more documents, but these were different from what he'd found in the cabin. These were sworn statements signed and witnessed. 3 different settlers describing how their land claims had been altered. Each statement followed the same pattern. They'd filed legitimate claims, worked their land, then discovered months later that the territorial office had no record of their full claim. Boundaries had been changed, acreage reduced. When they protested, they were threatened. One statement was from a man named William Patterson, dated August 1848. I filed claim for 160 acres in March 1847. Judge Harlan approved it. I built a cabin, cleared fields, worked the land for over a year. Then Joseph Garrett showed me a survey saying my claim was only 40 acres. The rest had been auctioned for unpaid fees I never knew about. Garrett himself bought it for $3. When I went to the territorial office, the clerk, a man named Severs, showed me papers I'd never seen before with my signature on them. The signature looked like mine, but I swear on my children I never signed those papers. Garrett gave me 2 choices: accept $50 for my cabin and leave, or be arrested for squatting on his land. I took the money and left with my family. I'm signing this statement for Samuel Blackwood because he says he will bring these crimes to light. I hope he succeeds where I was too afraid to fight. The other statements told similar stories. Good people driven from their land by corruption and threat of violence. The system itself had been weaponized against them. And these weren't just complaints. These were signed, witnessed legal documents that could be used as evidence in court. But there was more. At the bottom of the package was a small leather-bound ledger, much like the one Caleb had found in the cabin. But this one was different. The handwriting wasn't Samuel's. It was a careful clerk's script, recording transactions in neat columns. And it was damning. The ledger showed payments from Joseph Garrett to Judge Harlan, to the surveyor Severs, to the territorial claims clerk. Specific amounts, specific dates, with notes like Palmer claim adjustment and Henderson property transfer. This wasn't just evidence of conspiracy. This was the conspiracy's own record book. Someone, probably the clerk who'd been bribed, had kept a backup ledger, maybe as insurance, maybe as leverage. However Samuel had obtained it, it was absolute proof. Caleb rewrapped the documents and added them to his saddle pack with the coins and pocket watch. He was now carrying evidence that could have destroyed powerful men 70 years ago. The question was whether it still mattered, whether anyone still cared about old crimes. But even as he thought it, he knew the answer. Someone cared. The 3 strangers in Pinewood cared. They'd come looking for something, asking questions about old claims and properties. That couldn't be coincidence. He rode back toward the cabin as afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley. The sky was clear, the air sharp with coming cold. Beautiful country, peaceful and still. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that the peace was temporary. Something was building, some confrontation he couldn't yet see clearly. He was halfway home when he noticed the tracks. Fresh horse prints in the snow, leading toward his cabin. At least 3 horses, maybe 4, all shod. They'd passed this way within the last few hours, while he'd been at the mine shaft. Caleb urged Duchess to a faster pace. The tracks led straight to his clearing. As he approached, he slowed, studying the situation carefully. No smoke from the chimney. The door was closed, but something felt wrong. He dismounted well back from the cabin and tied Duchess in the trees. Moving quietly, rifle ready, he circled around to approach from the side. The tracks showed clearly now. 4 horses had come, the riders had dismounted, spent time around the cabin, then ridden off toward the east. But before they'd left, they'd been inside. The door stood closed, but the thread he'd placed across the jamb was broken. The twig on the windowsill was missing. Someone had entered the cabin and searched it. Caleb approached carefully, checking the windows before trying the door. It swung open easily. Inside, his few possessions had been thoroughly ransacked. His bedding was pulled apart, his supplies scattered, even the floorboards he'd replaced had been pried up in places. Someone had conducted a serious search, but they hadn't found what they were looking for. The hearthstone was undisturbed. They apparently hadn't thought to check beneath it. The original document Samuel had hidden was still safe, and everything Caleb had found today was in his saddle pack out in the trees with Duchess. Still, the message was clear. Someone knew he had something, and they were willing to break in and search for it. The polite phase of this situation, if there'd ever been one, was over. Caleb spent the next hour putting his cabin back in order and fortifying it. He reinforced the door with a bar he fashioned from a pine plank. He positioned his bedroll where he could watch both the door and the window. He loaded his rifle and his spare pistol, then laid them within easy reach. This was no longer just a cabin. It was a position that might need defending. As darkness fell, he sat by the window and took out Samuel's pocket watch. It ticked steadily in his hand, marking the present moment even as it connected him to the past. Samuel Blackwood had faced this same kind of threat 70 years ago. Men who would steal, lie, and probably kill to protect their crimes and their profits. Samuel had tried to fight back with truth and evidence. He'd carefully documented everything, hidden his proof, and planned to bring it to authorities who might listen. But something had stopped him. Death, capture, or fear. Caleb would probably never know which. Samuel had vanished, and his evidence had waited in hiding for someone to find it. Now Caleb had found it. And the question was what he would do with it, whether he'd finish what Samuel started, or whether he'd let the past stay buried to save himself from whatever storm was coming. He watched the darkness outside his window and thought about the choices a man makes, about standing up or walking away, about the difference between the two, and what it costs either way. The pocket watch ticked on, steady and patient, marking time that moved forward, whether a man was ready or not. Morning brought clarity and decision. Caleb had spent half the night watching his door, and the other half thinking. By dawn, he knew what he needed to do. If people were searching for Samuel's evidence, they already believed he had it or knew where it was. Hiding wouldn't help. The only way forward was to understand exactly what he possessed and why it mattered so much 70 years after the fact. He made coffee and spread all the documents across his table in the lamplight. The original land grant deed from the cabin, the ledgers and statements from the mine shaft, the coins and pocket watch from the trading post site, and Samuel's journal and map tying it all together. As he studied them with fresh eyes, something caught his attention that he'd missed before. The original land grant deed from 1847 showed 400 acres, granted to Samuel Blackwood and Joseph Garrett jointly. But there was another document beneath it in the stack from the cabin, a survey map, hand-drawn but official-looking, with the territorial seal in the corner. Caleb unfolded it carefully. It was dated 1848, just a few months before Samuel's final journal entry. The map showed the same valley, but with detailed boundary markings and measurements. And the boundaries showed something significant. The 400 acres weren't just the valley floor. They included water rights to the entire creek system, timber rights to the pine forests on the surrounding ridges, and mineral rights to everything beneath the surface. In 1847, such rights might have been worth a few $100s. But now, in 1891, with railroads pushing through Montana and mining operations expanding, those rights were worth thousands. More than that, Caleb traced the property lines with his finger. The boundaries extended right across the natural pass that connected this valley to the next. Any railroad line wanting to run through this region would have to cross this property. The rights holder could name their price or block the railroad entirely. That was why people cared about a 70-year-old land grant. Not because of old crimes or justice for Samuel Blackwood. Because this land, These rights were worth serious money to anyone planning development in the region. But who held those rights now? The deed showed joint ownership between Samuel and Joseph. When Samuel disappeared, Joseph would have claimed it all. He'd have filed papers showing Samuel as a fugitive thief who'd abandoned his share. Joseph would have become sole owner by default. Then Joseph would have passed it to his heirs. Eventually, it would have come down to Mrs. Garrett, who'd sold Caleb the cabin and 40 acres. But had she sold him just 40 acres, or had she sold him the entire original grant? The deed she'd signed over was old, going back to her husband's purchase from the territorial office years ago. But what if that deed was based on the original grant, not the altered records? Caleb needed to check the county records, compare what Mrs. Garrett had given him to what was officially filed. But that meant another trip to Pinewood, and after yesterday's break-in, he wasn't eager to leave the cabin unguarded for long. The sound of horses broke his concentration. He moved to the window and looked out carefully. 2 riders approaching, but these were different from the ones who'd watched the cabin before. Caleb recognized them, Sheriff Brennan and someone riding behind him. He opened the door as they reached the clearing. Brennan raised a hand in greeting, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Morning, Mr. Stone. Didn't mean to startle you." "Sheriff, who's your friend?" The other rider was a woman, bundled in a heavy coat against the cold. As she pushed back her hood, Caleb recognized her, Mrs. Garrett. She looked older than when he'd seen her in town, her face drawn and worried. "Mrs. Garrett asked me to bring her out here," Brennan said. "She has something to tell you. I figured it was important enough to warrant the ride." Caleb invited them inside. He cleared space at the table and poured coffee. Mrs. Garrett wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at him with those sharp blue eyes. "I owe you an explanation, Mr. Stone, and an apology." "For what?" "For not being entirely honest when I sold you this property." She took a breath. "I knew about the documents hidden in this cabin. Not what they said exactly, but that they existed. My husband's grandfather told him stories before he died. Stories about Samuel Blackwood and the old partnership, about evidence hidden away, about secrets that were meant to stay buried." "Your husband's grandfather was Samuel Blackwood's son," Caleb said. "The boy in the photograph," she looked startled. "You found the watch yesterday, along with everything else Samuel hid. Then you know the whole story, or part of it anyway." She sipped her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "My husband's grandfather was raised by the Garrett family after Samuel disappeared. Joseph and his wife took the boy in. They could have left him to starve, but they didn't. They raised him as their own, though they never let him forget he was a Blackwood, and what that meant. What did it mean? That his father was a thief who ran off, that the Blackwood name was disgraced. But when the boy grew up, his name was Thomas. He had his own thoughts about what happened. He'd been only 5 when his father disappeared, but he remembered him. Remembered a good man, an honest man. He never quite believed the Garrett family version of events. Did he look for the truth? He tried. But by then everyone involved was dead or scattered. Joseph passed in 1873. Judge Harlan died years before that. Thomas found some irregularities in old land records, but nothing he could prove. And the Garrett family, my husband's family, they didn't want the past examined too closely. So Thomas kept quiet, married, had children. He passed his suspicions to his son, my husband, along with the knowledge that Samuel had hidden something in the cabin. Why tell him if they wanted it buried? Because Thomas believed his father had been wronged, and he wanted someone to know. He thought maybe someday the truth would matter. My husband felt the same way. She looked around the cabin. We kept this place, but never used it much. I think he was afraid of what he might find if he looked too hard. But you sold it to me. I'm 73 years old, Mr. Stone. My husband died last year. My children are grown and gone. I sat in that house in town and thought about all those years of keeping secrets, protecting people who'd been dead for decades. And I thought, why? What's the point? So you sold the cabin to a stranger, hoping he'd find what your family didn't want found. I sold it to someone who wasn't part of the old families, who didn't have a stake in keeping the past hidden. Someone who might have the courage to bring truth to light, whatever that truth was. She smiled slightly. You came to town looking weathered and honest. I took a chance. Sheriff Brennan had been listening quietly. Now he spoke. There's more she needs to tell you. About what's happening now, Mrs. Garrett nodded. 3 weeks ago, a man came to see me. His name is Silas Vaughn, and he's a lawyer from Helena. He told me there was a competing claim on the Blackwood Valley property. A company called Territorial Development wants to purchase the land for a railroad right-of-way. They're offering a substantial sum. How much? $5,000 for 40 acres. She let that sink in. That's far more than the land is worth for farming or timber. Mr. Vaughn explained that the railroad needs this exact route, and they're willing to pay for it. What did you tell him? I told him I'd already sold the property. To you, he was not pleased. He offered to buy it from you through me, offering $10,000. Caleb whistled softly. That's serious money. It is. And it made me suspicious. So I did something I should have done years ago. I went to the county office and looked up the original deed, the real one from 1847. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded paper. This is a copy. Caleb took it and read carefully. It was the same land grant he'd found in the cabin, but this was the official county record. 400 acres, water rights, timber rights, mineral rights, all deeded jointly to Samuel Blackwood and Joseph Garrett. There's more, Mrs. Garrett said. I found the amended deed from 1850, filed after Samuel disappeared. It transferred ownership to Joseph Garrett alone and reduced the acreage to 40. But here's what matters, that amended deed was never properly witnessed. Under territorial law at the time, a transfer like that required 3 witnesses and a judge's signature. This one had only Joseph Garrett's signature and a clerk's mark, meaning it wasn't legal, meaning the original grant is still technically valid. The whole 400 acres, all the rights. And when I sold you this property, I used my husband's deed, which goes back to his grandfather's inheritance, which goes back to the original grant. I didn't sell you 40 acres, Mr. Stone. I sold you 400, whether I knew it or not. Caleb sat back, his mind working through the implications. So I own the entire valley, including the pass where the railroad wants to run. That's what Mr. Vaughn and his company realized when they checked the records. That's why they're so interested in buying you out. And when I refused to help them, they started looking for other ways to acquire the property, like finding Samuel's evidence and using it to cloud the title. Exactly. If they could prove the original partnership was based on fraud, or that Samuel really was a thief, they might be able to challenge the entire chain of ownership. They could tie the property up in court for years, or force a settlement in their favor. Sheriff Brennan leaned forward. Those 3 men who came to town, they work for Vaughn. And they're not just looking through records. Yesterday, the county clerk's office was broken into. Nothing was taken, but someone went through all the old land files. And last night, someone searched the Historical Society's archives. They're looking for anything that supports their version of history, Mrs. Garrett said. Anything that makes Samuel Blackwood look like a criminal. But what they really want is what Samuel hid, Caleb said. Evidence that proves the opposite. If you have it, Mr. Stone, you need to protect it. And yourself. She looked at him with concern. These aren't people who will stop at property crimes. Caleb thought about the cabin ransacked while he was gone, about the riders watching from the trees. They've already been here. They searched the place yesterday. Brennan's jaw tightened. Did they take anything? They didn't find what they were looking for, but they'll be back. Then we need to get ahead of this, Brennan said. If you have evidence of fraud in the original land claims, that's not just a property dispute, that's criminal. Even if it's old crimes, it matters. I can contact the Territorial Marshal's office, get proper authorities involved. That will take time, Mrs. Garrett said. Meanwhile, Mr. Vaughn and his men will keep pushing. They've already tried to buy the property. When that didn't work, they started looking for ways to take it. What comes next? The answer hung in the air, unspoken but understood. What came next was pressure, legal, physical, whatever it took. Men who offered $10,000 for 40 acres of nothing special wouldn't give up just because Caleb said no. They'd escalate. I need to see what's in the official records, Caleb said. Compare them to what Samuel documented. If I can prove the original fraud, it strengthens my claim to the land and undermines whatever case they're trying to build. The county office is in Pinewood, Brennan said. I can get you access to the old files. When? Now if you want. I'll take you in. Mrs. Garrett can stay here or ride back with us. I'll stay, she said firmly. Someone should watch the cabin. And besides, this is as much my fight as yours, Mr. Stone. My family has been carrying this burden for 3 generations. It's time to set it down properly. Caleb looked at this elderly woman who'd sold him a cabin for $200 and, whether intentionally or not, handed him 400 acres and a century-old fight. She was tougher than she looked. I appreciate that, ma'am. But if Vaughn's men come while I'm gone, I have my husband's rifle, and I know how to use it. I've lived in Montana for 50 years, Mr. Stone. I'm not helpless. Brennan smiled slightly. She's not. Trust me. Caleb gathered the documents he'd found, wrapped them carefully, and secured them in his coat. The original deed, Samuel's journal, the ledgers, the sworn statements, everything that proved what had really happened 70 years ago. If he was going to fight this, he needed ammunition, and truth was the best kind he had. Before they left, he showed them the survey map he'd been studying. Brennan examined it closely, then pulled out a more modern map for comparison. This is interesting, the sheriff said. Your property, if this original survey is accurate, includes the entire pass. But more than that, see this section here? That's where they found silver last year. Small strike, but enough to get people interested. If there are mineral rights with this deed, you own whatever's under this ground. How much would that be worth? Hard to say. But combined with the railroad right-of-way and the timber, could be $50,000, maybe more. Mrs. Garrett shook her head. No wonder they're pushing so hard. This isn't about old justice or historical claims. This is about money. Serious money. It always is, Caleb said. He'd seen it before. Greed wearing the mask of legitimacy, men willing to lie and steal and worse for profit. The amount might be bigger than usual, but the pattern was familiar. They rode out together, Caleb and Sheriff Brennan, leaving Mrs. Garrett at the cabin with the fire built up and the rifle loaded. The sky was overcast, threatening more snow. The trail to Pinewood cut through silent forest, the only sound their horses' hooves crunching through the thin snow cover. You know this is going to get worse before it gets better, Brennan said after a while. I know. If you wanted to sell and walk away, I wouldn't blame you. $10,000 is more money than most men see in a lifetime. Is that what you'd do? Brennan was quiet for a moment. No, I'd fight. But I've got a badge and the law behind me. You're just one man with a deed and some old papers. I'm one man who bought property legally and found evidence of crimes. That should count for something. Should, yes. But territorial development has lawyers and money, and probably judges, on their payroll. Just like Judge Harlan back in 1848. The system doesn't change as much as we'd like to think. So what are you saying? I'm saying be careful. Document everything. And if it comes to it, don't be too proud to ask for help. There are still good people around who care about what's right. They rode on through the cold morning, and Caleb thought about Samuel Blackwood making this same journey in reverse, fleeing toward the high country with evidence in his saddlebag and killers on his trail. History didn't repeat exactly, but it echoed. The same greed, the same corruption, just wearing different names. The difference was that Samuel had been alone. Caleb had a sheriff willing to help, a determined old woman guarding his cabin, and a town full of people who'd been watching this unfold. Maybe that would be enough, or maybe like Samuel, he'd end up with nothing but good intentions and a pocket watch that stopped ticking. Either way, he'd find out soon enough. The county office sat at the end of Pinewood's main street, a square building that also housed the mayor's office and the town records. Inside, it smelled of old paper and ink. A young clerk looked up as Caleb and Sheriff Brennan entered, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the badge. Morning, Sheriff. How can I help you? Need to look at some old land records. Blackwood Valley property going back to the 1840s if you've got them. The clerk, whose name was Martin, led them to a back room lined with shelves of leather-bound ledgers and document boxes. Most of our records from the territorial period are in rough shape. We've been meaning to reorganize, but there's never time or money. What specifically are you looking for? Original land grants, surveys, transfers of ownership. Anything related to the Blackwood or Garrett families? Martin pulled down several ledgers and set them on a reading table. This'll take a while to go through. You need me to stay? No, we can manage. Thanks, Martin. After the clerk left, Caleb and Brennan began the careful work of searching through decades-old records. The ledgers were organized by year, but not always completely. Pages were missing in places, entries were incomplete, and the handwriting varied wildly in quality. But slowly, a picture emerged. They found the original 1847 land grant, exactly matching what Samuel had hidden. They found Joseph Garrett's 1850 claim filing that reduced the acreage to 40. And they found something else, a series of transactions in the years following that showed a pattern. Between 1848 and 1855, dozens of land claims in the surrounding territory had been amended or cancelled. In almost every case, the land ended up in the hands of a small group of buyers: Joseph Garrett, Judge Harlan, a man named Severs, who was listed as territorial surveyor, and several others whose names appeared in Samuel's hidden ledger. This wasn't just about Samuel's land, Brennan said quietly. This was systematic. They were stealing from everyone, and no one stopped them. Who would? The judge was corrupt, the surveyor was corrupt, and there was no higher authority paying attention. The territorial government was hundreds of miles away and barely functional. Perfect conditions for this kind of theft. They continued searching. Caleb found a box labeled Disputed Claims 1848-1852 and opened it. Inside were yellow documents, many of them complaints filed by settlers who claimed their land had been stolen through fraudulent surveys and false filings. The complaints went nowhere. Each one had a notation showing it was dismissed by Judge Harlan or resolved in favor of Joseph Garrett and his associates. Samuel wasn't alone in being robbed, Caleb said. There were dozens of them. All these families, all these complaints, all dismissed and all forgotten. Brennan shook his head. The settlers who complained either gave up and left, or they were driven out. The records show it happened, but no one ever did anything about it, until Samuel tried to. And look what happened to him. They were deep in the records when the door opened. Caleb looked up to see a man in a fine wool coat enter, brushing snow from his shoulders. He was perhaps 40, well-groomed, with sharp eyes that took in the scene immediately. Sheriff Brennan. I didn't expect to find you here, Mr. Vaughn. This is county property. Anyone can access public records. Of course. Silas Vaughn's gaze shifted to Caleb. And you must be Mr. Stone. I've been hoping to meet you. Caleb stood, keeping the table between them. Have you? Indeed. I represent Territorial Development Company. We've made what I consider a very generous offer for your property. Conveyed through Mrs. Garrett. I was disappointed to hear you weren't interested. The property's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. Mr. Stone, we're prepared to offer $15,000, cash, for a cabin and 40 acres you bought for $200 just weeks ago. That's a remarkable return on your investment. It's 40 acres I'm not interested in selling. Vaughn's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered in his eyes. May I ask why? You're a solitary man from what I understand. No family, no ties to this area. $15,000 would set you up comfortably anywhere you chose to go. Maybe I'm tired of going places. Maybe I want to stay. A noble sentiment, but impractical. The railroad is coming through this region, whether you cooperate or not. If you stand in the way, you'll simply be stepped over. It would be much better for everyone if we could reach an accommodation. Sheriff Brennan closed the ledger he'd been reading. Mr. Vaughn, are you threatening Mr. Stone? Not at all, Sheriff. Simply explaining economic realities. The railroad represents progress. Progress doesn't stop for individuals. It stops for property rights, Brennan said. Legal property rights, which is precisely why I'm here examining records, just as you are. I want to ensure we understand exactly what rights Mr. Stone possesses. Vaughn gestured at the open ledgers. And what rights he doesn't. The deed is clear, Caleb said, is it? I found the original grant quite interesting. A partnership between two men, one of whom fled as a fugitive. The legal disposition of such property is complex. My company is prepared to challenge Mr. Stone's claim in territorial court if necessary. On what grounds? On the grounds that the property transfer from the Garrett family to Mr. Stone may have been based on incomplete understanding of the true boundaries and rights involved. That certain historical facts, if properly examined, might show the land was never legally available for sale. Vaughn pulled a document from his coat. In fact, I have here a competing claim filed with the Territorial Office last week. My company asserts right of ownership based on an 1852 purchase from the original grantee, Joseph Garrett. That's impossible, Brennan said. The Garrett family held that land until Mrs. Garrett sold it to Mr. Stone, so they believed. But we've discovered an overlooked transaction. In 1852, Joseph Garrett sold certain rights to a mining concern. That concern eventually dissolved, but those rights, specifically mineral and subsurface rights, were never recovered by the Garrett family. Through careful research, we've traced those rights to their present holder, my company. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. This was the strategy then, not just buying him out, but attacking his claim from multiple directions. Challenge the deed, assert competing claims, tie everything up in legal disputes until he had no choice but to settle. Let me see that document, Brennan said. Vaughn handed it over. The sheriff read it carefully, his expression growing darker. This is dated 3 weeks ago, but it references a purchase from 1852. Where's the original 1852 document? In our files. We'll produce it when necessary. I'd like to see it now. That's not possible. But I assure you, it exists and will withstand legal scrutiny. I'm sure it will, Brennan said dryly. Just like all the other convenient documents that appear when they're needed. Vaughn's smile vanished. Are you suggesting something improper, Sheriff? I'm suggesting that I've seen this pattern before. Old claims suddenly discovered, convenient documents appearing from nowhere, legitimate owners pressured to sell or surrender. It's an old game, and the fact that it's dressed up in legal language doesn't make it honest. That's a serious accusation. It's an observation. And here's another one. If your claim is legitimate, you won't mind us examining every aspect of it thoroughly, including checking with the Territorial Archive in Helena to verify your 1852 document. For the first time, Vaughn looked slightly uncomfortable. That will take weeks. Then we have weeks. Vaughn turned his attention back to Caleb. Mr. Stone, I came here to make you a fair offer. I still hope you'll consider it. But if you choose to fight this in court, I should warn you, litigation is expensive. My company has deep pockets. We can afford to fight this for years. Can you? I can afford to stand my ground. Noble words. But when your money runs out, when the lawyers start billing you, when you realize you've spent years fighting over a piece of land that's worth far less than what we're offering, you'll wish you'd taken my offer today. Maybe, but I'll sleep better knowing I didn't let someone steal from me. Vaughn's face hardened. No one is stealing anything, Mr. Stone. We're simply asserting rights that legally belong to us. If you'd done your proper research before purchasing, you'd have discovered the clouded title yourself. That's your failure, not ours. The title wasn't clouded until you clouded it. That's a matter of interpretation. And interpretation is what courts are for. Vaughn picked up his hat. I'll give you 1 week to reconsider. After that, we file formal proceedings, and this becomes very expensive for you very quickly. He left, letting the door swing shut behind him. Caleb and Brennan stood in silence for a moment. That man is going to be a problem, Brennan said finally. He already is. Did you notice what he didn't mention? He said his company bought mineral rights in 1852, but he didn't mention water rights, timber rights, or the surface land itself. He's cherry-picking which parts of the grant he claims. Can he do that? Legally? Probably not. But he can claim it, file papers asserting it, and force you to prove him wrong in court. That's the game. Throw enough legal mud and hope some of it sticks. Caleb thought about the evidence he'd found, Samuel's documents proving the original fraud.
What if I can prove the 1852 sale never happened?
Or that if it did, it was part of the same fraud Samuel documented. Then you'd have a strong defense, but you'd need to prove it. And that means showing Samuel's evidence in court, which means admitting you found hidden documents in your cabin. Vaughn will ask how you knew to look for them, why you went searching through walls. He'll try to make you look like you're manipulating evidence, even though the evidence is real. Truth matters less than presentation in court sometimes. But yes, if you can prove systematic fraud, it undermines everything Vaughn's claiming. His 1852 document, if it even exists, would be fruit of the poisoned tree. They spent another hour searching records, copying down information, building a timeline of what had happened. The pattern was clear. Joseph Garrett and his co-conspirators had run a years-long scheme to steal land. The scheme had eventually ended, probably when key members died or moved on. But the stolen land remained in the hands of their descendants or companies they'd created. Territorial Development Company might be a new name, but it was probably. 3 days passed in tense watchfulness. The snow continued intermittently, piling up in the valley until the meadow was a smooth white expanse broken only by the dark line of the creek and the tracks Caleb made on his daily patrols. The riders on the ridge appeared twice more, distant figures watching but not approaching, waiting for something. Mrs. Garrett returned to Pinewood on the second day, escorted by Sheriff Brennan, but not before helping Caleb reinforce the cabin's defenses. They'd barred the windows from inside and positioned supplies where they'd be accessible during any siege. Caleb appreciated her help, but he also knew she needed to get back to her own life. She'd done more than enough. Brennan promised to return as soon as he heard back from Helena about Vaughn's claimed 1852 document. In the meantime, Caleb was to stay alert and not take chances. Left alone, Caleb fell into a routine. He rose before dawn, built up the fire, and made his morning patrol of the property. Then he spent time working on the cabin, not because it needed much work now, but because the activity kept him occupied and alert. In the afternoons, he read through Samuel's journal again, looking for details he might have missed. It was during one of these readings, on the third evening, that something caught his attention. Not in the journal itself, but in the leather satchel he'd found it in. He'd examined the satchel before, but casually. Now he looked at it more carefully. The leather was old and cracked, the stitching rotted in places. But the satchel was well made, the kind a military man might carry. Caleb ran his fingers along the seams, feeling for anything unusual. There at the bottom, a double thickness. Not damage, but intentional construction. He fetched his knife and carefully picked at the stitching. The thread gave way, and a hidden compartment opened. Inside was another oilskin package, smaller than the others, pressed flat and nearly invisible against the bottom of the satchel. Caleb's hands were steady as he unfolded the oilskin. Inside were letters, not many, perhaps a dozen sheets, but their condition was better than the journal's. Protected by the additional layer of concealment, the first letter was dated March 15, 1849, and it was addressed to Samuel Blackwood. The handwriting was official, precise, and the header read, United States Marshal's Office, Montana Territory. Caleb carried the letters to the table and read by lamplight. Mr. Blackwood, I am in receipt of your communication dated February 28, regarding allegations of systematic fraud in territorial land claims. Your documentation is extensive and, if verified, suggests criminal conspiracy involving territorial officials. I am prepared to investigate these matters and provide federal protection for you and your family as material witnesses. However, I must stress the danger involved. The individuals you have named are powerful and well-connected. Several attempts have already been made to discredit your testimony through the theft charges filed against you in the territorial court. I propose we meet at a location of your choosing, where you can present your evidence in person. Upon verification, I will place you and your family under federal protection and proceed with formal charges against those involved. Please respond through the same courier at your earliest convenience. Time is of the essence. As I understand, there is an active warrant for your arrest through territorial authorities. Respectfully, Marshal Thomas Wade. Caleb set down the letter and picked up the next one. It was Samuel's response, dated March 22nd, 1849. Marshal Wade, thank you for your willingness to investigate. I'm prepared to present all evidence in my possession, including original documents, ledgers, and sworn statements from other victims of this fraud. However, I face a difficulty. My family is already in hiding, sent away to safety. I'm alone and being actively hunted by men in the employ of Joseph Garrett and his associates. An attempt was made on my life last week. I barely escaped. I have divided the evidence into multiple caches for security. If something happens to me before we can meet, this letter will serve as a map to those locations. But I hope it will not be necessary, and that I may present the evidence to you in person. I propose we meet at the old trading post site on April 1st at noon. It's remote enough to avoid detection, yet accessible. I will come armed but alone. I ask that you do the same, to avoid alarming anyone who might be watching. If I do not appear, you may assume I have been arrested or killed. In that event, I beg you to continue the investigation for the sake of justice and for all those who have been wronged. Sincerely, Samuel Blackwood. The next letter was from Marshal Wade, dated March 28, 1849, confirming the meeting and promising discretion. But after that, the correspondence changed tone dramatically. April 5th, 1849, Marshal Wade to someone named Deputy Carson. Samuel Blackwood did not appear at our arranged meeting on April 1st. I waited for 3 hours. No sign of him, no message. My inquiries in the nearby settlement suggest he was seen heading toward the meeting location 2 days prior, but no one has seen him since. I fear the worst. Garrett's men may have intercepted him. Without Blackwood's testimony and evidence, we cannot proceed with formal charges. The documentation he sent me is suggestive, but not sufficient on its own. We need the original documents and the sworn statements he mentioned. Continue investigating Blackwood's disappearance. Check the obvious places: the jail, known associates of Garrett, any recent burials or disturbances. This man was prepared to risk his life to expose corruption. If he's been silenced, that itself is a crime we must answer for. Another letter, April 20th, 1849. No trace of Samuel Blackwood found. The territorial sheriff claims ignorance. Judge Harlan states Blackwood was a fugitive who likely fled the territory entirely. Joseph Garrett expresses confidence that the thief has run off to avoid justice. I do not believe any of these men. But without evidence or a body, I cannot prove foul play. The investigation is at a standstill. I am filing a formal report with the federal office noting suspicious circumstances surrounding Blackwood's disappearance and potential obstruction of justice by territorial officials. However, without physical evidence or witnesses, this case may remain unsolved. The final letter was dated May 1849 and addressed to the U.S. Marshal Service Headquarters. I must report failure in the Blackwood matter. The witness has disappeared, presumed dead or driven from the territory. The evidence he promised to deliver was never recovered. The territorial officials he accused continue in their positions, and without solid proof of wrongdoing, I cannot proceed with charges. However, I am convinced that Samuel Blackwood was telling the truth. The pattern of land claim alterations, the suspicious timing of amended surveys, the complaints from multiple settlers, all of it points to systematic fraud. But the system itself is corrupt, and fighting it from within territorial jurisdiction appears impossible. I recommend federal oversight of land claims in this region and investigation of Judge Harlan and his associates through channels that bypass territorial authority. Otherwise, this fraud will continue unchecked. Marshal Thomas Wade. Caleb sat back, his mind racing. Samuel had contacted a U.S. Marshal. He'd had federal protection offered. But he'd never made it to the meeting. Something had happened in those 2 days, between leaving for the meeting and disappearing completely. Had he been ambushed on the trail, arrested under false pretenses? Or had he hidden the evidence, planning to retrieve it after the meeting, but never got the chance? Whatever happened, Samuel had vanished, and the marshal's investigation had died with him. The corruption he'd tried to expose had continued, eventually fading only because the key players died or moved on. But the stolen land remained stolen, the fraud unpunished, the victims forgotten, until now. Caleb reread the letters carefully, noting details. Marshal Wade had believed Samuel. He'd been prepared to provide federal protection and pursue charges. That meant Samuel's evidence was credible and substantial, more than just accusations. But proof, and that proof was exactly what Caleb had found hidden in the cabin. At the trading post site and in the mine shaft, the evidence Samuel had been carrying to the marshal, evidence he'd hidden when he realized he might not survive to deliver it. But there was something else in these letters, something that changed everything. Marshal Wade had written that without Samuel's evidence, he couldn't proceed with charges. That meant the evidence Samuel had collected was unique, probably the only copies of the documents proving the fraud. If Territorial Development Company was connected to the old conspiracy, they wouldn't just want to suppress the evidence. They'd want to destroy it, because it was the only thing that could prove their current claims were built on historical fraud. Suddenly, Vaughan's aggressive tactics made more sense. This wasn't just about buying land for a railroad. It was about protecting a much larger interest, possibly hundreds of thousands of acres that had been stolen through the same methods used against Samuel. If the fraud was exposed and proven, it could trigger legal challenges to dozens or hundreds of land titles across the territory. The stakes were enormous. Not just Caleb's 400 acres, but potentially the entire foundation of property rights in this region. That's why Vaughan was pushing so hard. That's why mysterious riders were watching the cabin. They weren't just trying to acquire valuable land. They were trying to prevent an exposure that could unravel a century of ill-gotten gains. Caleb stood and walked to the window. Full darkness had fallen, and the valley was lost in shadow. But he could see lamplight reflecting off the snow, and in that light he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Footprints, fresh ones, leading from the tree line toward the cabin. Multiple sets approaching from different directions. He grabbed his rifle and doused the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness. His eyes adjusted slowly. Outside, he could hear nothing, the snow-muffled sound. But the footprints were there, clear evidence that men were approaching. Caleb moved to the door and listened. Still nothing. Then softly the sound of boots crunching in snow. Close, very close. A voice called out from the darkness. "Stone! We need to talk!" Caleb recognized the voice, Silas Vaughan. He positioned himself beside the window where he could see out but remain in shadow. "Talk from where you are," Caleb called back. "I'd prefer to come inside. It's cold out here. I'd prefer you stay where I can see you." A pause. Then Vaughan stepped into the reflected lamplight from the snow. He was flanked by 2 men, both armed. The 3 riders who'd been watching from the ridge, now standing in Caleb's yard. "Last chance, Stone. Sell me the property. $20,000. Final offer. Property's not for sale. Then we'll take it. One way or another, that's theft, Vaughan. You want to add that to fraud?" Even at this distance, Caleb could see Vaughan stiffen. "What fraud?" "The fraud Samuel Blackwood documented. The fraud that's been going on for 70 years. The fraud your company is built on." Long silence. "Then you don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I found everything Samuel hid. The ledgers, the statements, the proof. And I know he was working with a U.S. Marshal to expose it all. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not my land, but what my land represents. Evidence that your whole operation is criminal. You're making serious accusations. I'm stating facts. And those facts are already on their way to the Federal Marshal's office in Helena. So whatever you're planning here tonight, it won't change anything. The truth is out." Another long silence. Caleb could practically hear Vaughan thinking, calculating. "Finally, you've made a serious mistake, Stone. You should have taken the money when you had the chance." Probably. But I've made plenty of mistakes in my life. What's one more? Vaughn turned to his men, said something Caleb couldn't hear, then walked back toward the tree line. The two armed men remained, standing in the snow, watching the cabin. Caleb kept his rifle ready and settled in for a long night. Vaughn had shown his hand. He wasn't going to buy the property. He was going to take it. The only questions were how and when. The answer came an hour later when Caleb smelled smoke. The smoke was coming from the lean-to where the firewood was stacked. Caleb saw the orange glow through the window. They'd set fire to his wood supply, probably hoping to either flush him out or burn down the cabin entirely. He acted fast. Grabbing a bucket, he burst through the door and ran for the creek. The two armed men were caught off guard by his sudden appearance. One raised his rifle, but Caleb was already moving, using the cabin for cover. He reached the creek, filled the bucket in the icy water, and ran back. The lean-to was fully ablaze now, flames licking up the dry wood. Caleb threw water on it, then ran for another bucket. The men had recovered from their surprise and were advancing. Caleb heard shots, bullets kicking up snow around him, but he kept moving, kept filling buckets, kept fighting the fire. After the fourth trip, the flames were mostly out, just smoldering wood and smoke. Caleb turned to face the approaching men, his rifle ready. They stopped, recognizing the standoff. In the darkness beyond, he heard horses, Vaughn and probably more men. "Back away," Caleb called. "This is my property, and you're trespassing. We're taking what should never have been yours," one of the men shouted back. "On whose authority?" "On Mr. Vaughn's authority. He owns this land. He owns nothing but lies and false claims." They stood facing each other across 20 yards of snow. Nobody moved. Then from the direction of town, Caleb heard something that changed everything. More horses, coming fast. The riders burst into the clearing, and Caleb recognized Sheriff Brennan leading them. Behind him were Dutch Miller, Billy from the livery stable, and 4 other men from Pinewood. "All armed. That's enough." Brennan's voice cut through the night. "Vaughn, call off your men." Silas Vaughn emerged from the shadows, his face twisted with anger. "This is private business, Sheriff. This is attempted arson and trespassing with intent to harm. I'm arresting your men." "On what evidence?" "On my evidence," Caleb said. "I watched them set fire to my property." "And on ours," Dutch Miller added. "We've been watching them from the ridge for the past hour." "Saw the whole thing." Vaughn's men looked at each other, then at the superior numbers facing them. Slowly, they lowered their weapons. Brennan dismounted and approached with his revolver drawn. "You 3, drop your guns and come with me. Mr. Vaughn, you can ride back to Pinewood on your own, or I can escort you in chains. Your choice. This isn't over, Brennan. Maybe not. But it's over for tonight." Vaughn's men surrendered their weapons, and Brennan's group escorted them toward town. Before leaving, Brennan pulled Caleb aside, got a telegram from Helena. Vaughn's 1852 document doesn't exist in the Territorial Archive. There's no record of any mineral rights sale that year. He fabricated it, so his claim is fraud, complete fraud. I've sent a formal complaint to the U.S. Marshal's office, along with copies of Samuel's evidence. They're opening an investigation into Territorial Development Company and its ownership claims throughout the region. How long before they act? Days, maybe a week. But here's the thing. I also got a telegram back from the Marshal's office about Samuel Blackwood. They still have the old case file from 1849. Marshal Wade's reports, his correspondence, everything. When I mentioned we'd found Samuel's evidence, they got very interested. They're sending a deputy marshal to take custody of the documents and interview you. When? He should be here in 2 days. Until then, you need to stay safe. Vaughn knows he's running out of time. Tonight was desperation, but it might not be his last try. I can handle myself. I know you can. But you don't have to do it alone. Brennan gestured at the town men who'd ridden out with him. Word got around about what you found, about the old fraud. People remember stories their grandparents told. Families who lost land, settlers who were driven out. You're not just fighting for yourself, Caleb. You're fighting for justice that should have come 70 years ago. That means something to folks around here. After they left, Caleb stood alone in his yard looking at the smoldering lean-to. The cabin was safe, and he was unharmed. But the night's events had clarified something important. This wasn't ending peacefully. Vaughn had shown he was willing to use violence. Next time, he might not be interrupted by the sheriff. Caleb spent the next hour securing the property better. He dug a firebreak around the cabin so any future arson attempts would have less to burn. He positioned barrels of water at strategic points. He reinforced the door bar and shuttered the windows from inside, leaving only small gaps to see and shoot through if necessary. Then he sat down and read through Samuel's letters again, this time looking for anything else he might have missed. The letters confirmed what he'd suspected. Samuel had been murdered or driven off before he could meet Marshall Wade. The evidence he'd gathered, the same evidence Caleb now possessed, had been intended as insurance. If Samuel didn't survive, someone would eventually find it and finish what he'd started. That someone was apparently Caleb. He hadn't asked for this role, but he'd accepted it when he bought the cabin. And now he'd see it through, come what may. Morning came grey and cold. Caleb made coffee and sat watching the valley through his window. No riders on the ridge today. Either Vaughn had given up or he was planning something else. Caleb suspected the latter. Around mid-morning, Billy rode out from town with a message from Sheriff Brennan. Vaughn had made bail for his men and left Pinewood heading east toward Helena. He'd threatened legal action, accused Brennan of bias, and claimed he'd return with proper authorities to enforce his rights. Sheriff says to tell you it's a bluff, Billy explained. Vaughn's running because he knows the federal investigation will expose him. But he might try one more thing before he goes, something to destroy the evidence or discredit your claim. Watch yourself. I will. Thank you for the warning, Billy hesitated. Mr. Stone, a lot of folks in town are on your side. My great-grandfather lost his claim back in the 1850s. He always said it was stolen, but nobody believed him. Now we know he was right. If you need help, you just have to ask. After Billy left, Caleb thought about what the young man had said. He'd come to this valley looking for isolation, for a place to be alone. Instead, he'd found himself at the center of a community drama that reached back generations. Sometimes life gave you what you needed instead of what you wanted. The day passed quietly. Too quietly. Caleb maintained his watch, checked his defenses, and tried not to jump at every sound. By evening, he was exhausted from tension more than exertion. He was preparing dinner when he heard horses again. Not many, just two. He moved to the window and saw Sheriff Brennan returning, this time with an older woman Caleb didn't recognize. They dismounted, and Brennan called out, "It's just us, Caleb. Got someone who wants to meet you." Caleb opened the door. The woman was perhaps 60, dressed plainly, but with an air of quiet dignity. Her eyes were intelligent and kind. "Mr. Stone, this is Margaret Patterson." Her grandfather was William Patterson. The name clicked. "One of the men who signed a statement for Samuel Blackwood." "Yes," Margaret said. "My grandfather was driven from his land in 1848. He spent the rest of his life bitter about it, knowing he'd been robbed but unable to prove it. When Sheriff Brennan told me you'd found his sworn statement, I had to come see for myself." Caleb invited them inside and showed her the documents. Margaret read her grandfather's statement with tears in her eyes. "I've heard this story my whole life," she said, "but I never thought I'd see proof. My grandfather wasn't a liar or a fool. He was a good man who got cheated, and here it is in his own hand telling the truth. There are others," Caleb said. "Other families who were robbed?" Samuel Blackwood documented it all. "Samuel Blackwood," she repeated. "We heard about him too, the man who tried to fight back and disappeared. My grandfather always said if Samuel had lived, things might have been different. They still can be different. The U.S. Marshal's office is investigating. This evidence can expose what happened and maybe provide compensation for the families who lost their land." Margaret looked at him with something like hope. "Do you really think so? After all these years?" "I don't know. But I'm going to try." She reached out and clasped his hand. "Thank you. You've given us something we never thought we'd have, vindication. Whatever happens with the legal side, you've proven my grandfather was telling the truth. That matters. After Margaret and Brennan left, Caleb sat alone with his thoughts. He'd started this journey looking for a quiet place to live out his remaining years. Instead, he'd stumbled into a fight that mattered to people he'd never met, whose families had been wronged before he was even born. It was strange how life worked sometimes. You could spend decades wandering alone and then suddenly find yourself connected to dozens of people through shared purpose. The cabin he'd bought for $200 had become more than a home. It had become a symbol of justice, delayed but not forgotten. As night fell, Caleb made his final preparations. Tomorrow the deputy marshal would arrive. Caleb would hand over the evidence, give his statement, and let the federal government do its work. His part in this would be over. He could return to being just a man in a cabin, living quietly in a forgotten valley, except he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Vaughn was still out there, and desperate men did desperate things. One way or another, this would come to a head before the marshal arrived. Caleb could feel it like a storm building just beyond the horizon. He checked his rifle one more time, made sure he had plenty of ammunition, and settled in to wait. Whatever was coming, he'd face it. He'd faced worse in his life, and he was still standing. This time wouldn't be different. The pocket watch Samuel had hidden 70 years ago sat on the table beside him, ticking steadily. Time moved forward, carrying everything with it. Old crimes toward judgment, old wrongs toward resolution. All Caleb had to do was survive long enough to see it through. He watched the darkness outside his window and waited for dawn. The gunfight settled into a tense pattern. Vaughn's men would fire from cover, trying to keep Caleb and Mitchell pinned while others attempted to advance. Each time someone moved, Caleb or Mitchell would place a shot close enough to drive them back. Nobody wanted to be the first one killed, which worked in the defenders' favor, but ammunition wasn't infinite, and time was working against them. Caleb counted his remaining cartridges, maybe 30 rounds. Mitchell had less. If this dragged on too long, they'd be helpless. We need to break their momentum, Mitchell said during a lull in the shooting. Make them think the cost is too high. I'm open to suggestions. The lean-to is still half burned. If we can start a bigger fire, create smoke, it might give us cover to reposition or make them think reinforcements are arriving. Caleb considered it. Or it might just burn down the cabin. Rather that than let Vaughn take the evidence. Before they could act, a shout came from the tree line. "Mitchell! Stone! We've got someone here you might care about." Both men moved to the window. Two of Vaughn's men were dragging a prisoner into view. Billy, the young clerk from the livery stable. His hands were tied and his face was blooded. "Found him riding out from town," Vaughn called. "Probably coming to warn you. Doesn't matter now. You've got 1 minute to surrender the documents, or we shoot the boy." Mitchell's jaw tightened. "They're bluffing." "They wouldn't." "They would," Caleb said quietly. "Look at Vaughn's face. He's desperate enough to do anything." Billy was forced to his knees in the open. One of the gunmen put a pistol to his head. The boy looked terrified but defiant, his eyes finding Caleb's through the cabin window. 30 seconds. Vaughn shouted. Mitchell looked at Caleb. "I can't let them kill that boy." "Neither can I." Caleb's mind raced through options. If they surrendered the documents, Vaughn would destroy them, and probably kill all 3 of them anyway. If they didn't, Billy would die. There had to be another way. Then he remembered something. The survey map with the territorial seal. Mitchell had examined it closely, noting that the seal proved federal jurisdiction. If that seal was authentic and official, it carried legal authority that superseded territorial claims. "Marshal," Caleb said quickly, "that survey map, the one with the territorial seal, is it enough by itself to establish my claim?" "It's strong evidence, yes. Why?" "Because we're going to give them what they want, or what they think they want." Caleb grabbed the survey map and the iron lockbox, empty now, its contents already in Mitchell's custody. He held them up to the window so Vaughn could see. "All right," Caleb shouted. "You want the evidence? You can have it. Let the boy go. Bring it out here. Both of you, hands visible." Caleb looked at Mitchell. "Trust me, the real evidence stays here. This is the decoy." Understanding dawned in Mitchell's eyes. "The map is evidence enough. And they don't know we've already secured everything else. They made a show of gathering documents, some of the less critical papers Caleb had found, along with the survey map prominently displayed. Caleb tucked them into the iron lockbox and held it ready. "We're coming out," Caleb called. "Don't shoot!" He and Mitchell stepped onto the porch, hands raised, the lockbox held between them. Vaughan's men emerged from cover, rifles trained on them. Billy was still on his knees, the pistol at his head. "Set the box down and step back," Vaughan ordered. Caleb placed the lockbox on the ground halfway between the cabin and where Vaughan stood. Then he and Mitchell stepped back, hands still raised. Vaughan approached cautiously, his eyes never leaving them. He reached the box and opened it, rifling through the contents. He pulled out the survey map and studied it, his face showing satisfaction. "This is what I needed," he said. "The map showing the original boundaries. With this gone, your claim has no support, Stone." "Then let the boy go." Vaughan gestured, and his man released Billy, shoving him forward. The boy stumbled, but stayed on his feet, running toward the cabin. Caleb caught him and pulled him to safety behind the cabin wall. "Now," Vaughan said, "we're leaving. Mitchell, I'd advise you to forget this whole matter. Stone, consider yourself fortunate I'm feeling generous. You can keep your cabin, but you'll sign over any claim to the full 400 acres. My lawyers will draw up the papers." Mitchell's voice was cold. "You're not leaving with that evidence, Vaughan. What are you going to do, Marshal? You're outnumbered and outgunned. Be smart and let this go. That map carries the territorial seal. It's official federal property. Taking it is theft of government documents. I can't let that stand," Vaughan laughed. "The seal? It's just ink on old paper. It doesn't—" He stopped, his face changing as understanding struck. "You tricked me. This isn't all of it. You've already secured the other documents. Every page," Mitchell confirmed. "I have Blackwood's complete evidence in federal custody. That map you're holding is just the beginning. And by taking it, you've just committed a federal crime in front of witnesses." Vaughan's face twisted with rage. "You—" The sound of horses interrupted him. Many horses, coming fast from the direction of Pinewood. Sheriff Brennan burst into the clearing at the head of a group of mounted townsmen, Dutch Miller, Margaret Patterson, Mrs. Garrett, and at least a dozen others. "That's enough." Brennan's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Vaughan, you and your men are under arrest." But Vaughan wasn't ready to surrender. His hand moved to his coat, reaching for a hidden derringer. Caleb saw it and reacted instantly, his rifle coming up, even as Mitchell's revolver cleared its holster. "Don't!" Mitchell shouted. Vaughan pulled the derringer, swinging it toward Mitchell. Two shots rang out as one, Caleb's rifle and Mitchell's revolver. Vaughan's derringer fired wild, the bullet going high and wide. Then Vaughan was falling, the gun tumbling from his hand. He hit the ground hard and didn't move. Mitchell rushed forward, kicking the derringer away, but it was unnecessary. Vaughan was dead, killed by bullets that had prevented him from murdering a federal officer. The fight went out of Vaughan's men immediately. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Brennan's men moved in to take them into custody, and within minutes, the clearing was secured. Mitchell knelt beside Vaughan's body, checking for any sign of life. Finding none, he stood and looked at Caleb. "Clean shooting. You saved my life." "He didn't give us a choice." "No, he didn't." Mitchell picked up the lockbox and the survey map Vaughan had dropped. "This stays in evidence, along with everything else." Brennan approached, his face grim. "Billy came to town, saying you had a federal marshal out here, and that Vaughan was planning something. We rode out as fast as we could. You timed it perfectly," Mitchell said. "Few more minutes, and this could have gone much worse." Mrs. Garrett climbed down from her horse and looked at the scene. The damaged cabin, the body in the snow, the armed men being tied and guarded. "Is it really over?" "The shooting's over," Mitchell said. "The legal part is just beginning." "But yes, ma'am. The conspiracy that destroyed your family and so many others, that's finished now." She nodded slowly, tears in her eyes. "Samuel Blackwood tried to end it 70 years ago. He failed, but he left the means for someone else to succeed. Mr. Stone found what Samuel hid and had the courage to use it. That's more than anyone in my family managed." "You helped," Caleb reminded her. "You sold me the cabin knowing what might be hidden there. That took its own kind of courage. As Brennan's men loaded Vaughan's body onto a horse and prepared the prisoners for the ride to Pinewood, Mitchell turned to Caleb. "I'll need you to come to Helena eventually, give a formal statement. But that can wait a few days. Right now, I think you've earned some peace and quiet. That's all I wanted to begin with. Well, you got justice instead. Sometimes that's more valuable." The group began the journey back to town, taking the prisoners and Vaughan's body. Caleb stayed behind with Sheriff Brennan and Mrs. Garrett to clean up and assess the damage. The cabin had taken bullets, but nothing structural. The windows would need replacing, and there were repairs to make, but the bones were sound. Just like Samuel Blackwood had built it, strong enough to outlast the storms that came against it. As evening approached, they finished their work. Brennan prepared to leave, escorting Mrs. Garrett back to town. Before mounting his horse, he shook Caleb's hand. "You did good work here, not just finding the evidence, but standing up when it mattered. Samuel Blackwood would be proud. I just finished what he started. That's more than most people would do. You take care now. I'll be out to check on you in a few days." They rode away, and Caleb stood alone in his clearing as the sun set behind the mountains. The valley was peaceful again, silent except for the creek and the wind through the pines. This was what he'd wanted: solitude, quiet, a place to rest. But now that he had it, it felt different. Not empty, but full of history, of connections to people and events that reached back through time. Samuel Blackwood's pocket watch sat on his table inside, still ticking, marking time that connected past to present. Caleb had bought a cabin for $200 and found himself fighting a war that began before he was born. And somehow, impossibly, he'd won. Not just for himself, but for Samuel, for the Patterson family, for all the settlers who'd been robbed and forgotten. Justice had finally come to Blackwood Valley. 70 years late, but still real. 3 weeks passed like water flowing over stones, steady, inevitable, washing away the immediate past into memory. The snow continued to fall and melt in cycles, winter settling into the valley in earnest. Caleb spent his days repairing the cabin, replacing the damaged windows, and restoring the peace that violence had temporarily shattered. The territorial marshal's office worked quickly once they had the evidence. The investigation into Territorial Development Company revealed that it was indeed connected to the original conspiracy, not through direct descendants of Joseph Garrett and Judge Harlan, but through a network of land companies that had inherited or purchased the fraudulently acquired properties over the decades. When the foundation of their claims was exposed as systematic fraud, the entire structure collapsed. Vaughan's death had removed the most aggressive defender of the conspiracy. But his associates faced federal prosecution for fraud, forgery, and attempted theft of government property. The trials would take months, but the outcome was certain. Too much evidence, too many witnesses, too clear a pattern of criminal behavior. For Caleb, the legal confirmation came in the form of a document delivered by Sheriff Brennan on a cold December morning. It was a federal declaration, signed by the territorial judge and the marshal's office, confirming Caleb's ownership of the full 400 acres described in the original 1847 land grant. Water rights, timber rights, mineral rights, all of it legally his. Free and clear of any competing claims. That makes you one of the largest landholders in this region, Brennan said, warming himself by Caleb's fire. The railroad still wants right-of-way access, but now they'll have to negotiate honestly and pay fair value. Probably talking about $30,000, maybe more. Caleb looked at the document, seeing his name written in official script. That's more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. It's what the land is worth. What it was always worth. Samuel Blackwood and Joseph Garrett knew it back in 1847, which is why they fought over it. Samuel didn't fight for money. He fought for justice, and now he has it. The territorial government issued a formal declaration clearing his name. Samuel Blackwood is officially recognized as an innocent man who was falsely accused and whose evidence exposed one of the largest land fraud cases in territorial history. Little late for him, but not for his memory, or for his descendants. Brennan pulled out another paper. We found Samuel's family. His son, the boy in the photograph, survived and had children. They're in Oregon. When they heard what you'd found, what you'd done, they wanted to thank you. That's a letter from Samuel's great-granddaughter. Caleb opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat and feminine. Dear Mr. Stone, I never knew my great-grandfather Samuel Blackwood. He disappeared before my grandmother was old enough to remember him. But I grew up hearing stories about him, conflicting stories. Some said he was a thief who abandoned his family. Others said he was a hero who died fighting corruption. Thanks to you, we now know the truth. My great-grandfather was a good man who stood up for what was right. He documented crimes, protected evidence, and tried to bring justice even when it cost him everything. The fact that his evidence finally accomplished what he intended means more to our family than I can express. You could have destroyed what you found or sold it to the people who wanted it buried. Instead, you finished what Samuel started. You gave him justice and gave our family the truth about who he really was. Thank you for your courage and your integrity. You honored a man you never met, and in doing so, honored all of us who carry his name. With deepest gratitude, Sarah Blackwood Crawford. Caleb set the letter down, his throat tight. He'd thought of this whole affair as simply doing what was right, standing his ground, protecting his property, exposing criminals. He hadn't considered what it meant to the Blackwood family, who'd lived for generations under the cloud of Samuel's disappearance and disgrace. There's more, Brennan said. The Marshal's office is recommending compensation for all the families who can prove their land was stolen through the fraud. That includes the Pattersons, the Hendersons, about 20 other families. Won't make them whole. Most of the land is gone, sold and resold to innocent buyers who can't be displaced. But they'll receive financial compensation based on the value of what was stolen. That's good. Better than nothing. Better than they ever thought they'd get. Margaret Patterson cried when I told her. Said her grandfather died bitter, thinking nobody cared about what happened to him. Now 70 years later, the government is admitting he was wronged and paying his family for it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire. Finally, Brennan stood to leave. One more thing. The town of Pinewood is talking about putting up a memorial for Samuel Blackwood and all the settlers who were defrauded. They want to name it the Blackwood Justice Memorial, with a list of all the families who were victims. Thought you should know. After Brennan left, Caleb spent the afternoon working on repairs. The cabin was nearly back to normal now, the bullet holes patched, the windows replaced, everything restored to the simple functionality he valued. But it felt different now. Not just his, but connected to something larger. That evening, Mrs. Garrett visited. She'd been out to the cabin several times since the shooting, always bringing food or supplies, always checking that Caleb was managing well. But this time, she had a specific purpose. I wanted to give you something, she said, pulling a small package from her coat. It belonged to my husband's grandfather, Thomas Blackwood, Samuel's son. He kept it his whole life and passed it down to my husband with instructions to pass it to someone worthy when the time came. Caleb unwrapped the package. Inside was a photograph, the same one from Samuel's pocket watch, but intact and clear. A young woman with a gentle smile, a baby in her arms, a small boy standing proud beside her. Samuel's family, frozen in time before everything fell apart. Thomas wanted whoever cleared his father's name to have this, Mrs. Garrett said. So they'd remember that Samuel wasn't just a name in old documents. He was a husband and father who loved his family and sacrificed everything for principles he believed in. Caleb studied the photograph, seeing the faces of people long dead but not forgotten. I'll take good care of it. I know you will. Just like you took good care of the truth, she smiled. My husband would have liked you, Mr. Stone. He spent his life torn between two families, the Garretts who raised him and the Blackwoods he came from. Now that the truth is known, maybe he can rest easier wherever he is. Over the following days, more visitors came. Billy brought supplies and news from town. Dutch Miller brought fresh-cut lumber to rebuild the lean-to properly. Margaret Patterson brought her grandchildren to see the cabin where history had been made. Each visitor brought gratitude, respect, and the sense that Caleb had become part of something he hadn't sought but couldn't refuse. The railroad company sent representatives to negotiate right-of-way access. They were polite, professional, and willing to pay fair value, $35,000 for permission to run their line through the pass. Caleb agreed, not because he needed the money, but because Samuel Blackwood's fight had never been about blocking progress. It had been about ensuring progress happened honestly, with fair dealing and respect for rights. As January arrived and the deep snow settled in, Caleb found himself living the quiet life he'd originally sought. But it was quiet in a different way than he'd imagined. Not isolation, but peace. Not withdrawal, but rest after meaningful labor. He'd spent 20 years wandering the mountains because he'd once failed to stand up when standing up mattered. That failure had haunted him, driven him into solitude, made him a man without a home. But buying a cabin for $200 had given him a chance at redemption he never expected. He'd stood up this time. He'd fought when fighting was necessary. And in doing so, he'd honored not just Samuel Blackwood, but all the people who'd been wronged and forgotten. The land he'd bought had become his, but more than that, it had become a symbol of justice restored. One evening in late January, Caleb sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the snow-covered peaks pink and gold. Samuel's pocket watch rested in his hand, ticking steadily, marking time that moved forward but never forgot what came before. The cabin behind him was warm, the chimney smoke rising straight in the still air. The valley stretched peaceful and white before him, his land legally and honestly his. And for the first time in 20 years, Caleb Stone felt something he'd almost forgotten: contentment. Not because of the money, though that was welcome. Not because of the land, though it was beautiful. But because he'd found what he'd been searching for all along without knowing it: a purpose, a community, and proof that one man standing for what's right could still make a difference. He'd bought a cabin for $200. What he'd found inside changed his life forever, just as the stories said it would. But not with gold or hidden treasure. With something far more valuable. The chance to be part of a story that mattered, to finish what a good man started, to prove that truth and justice, however delayed, were worth fighting for. The pocket watch ticked on in his hand. The sun set behind the mountains, and Caleb Stone, no longer wandering, sat peacefully in the home he'd earned, watching the valley where he finally belonged.